The skies over Germany in 1944 were no longer safe. Allied bombers thundered relentlessly over cities and factories, while fighter planes prowled the clouds, striking with deadly precision. Germany's once dominant Luftwaffe struggled to keep pace, its numbers diminished by attrition, its pilots exhausted, and its morale fraying. In the midst of this mounting crisis, a single hope glimmered in the mind of Adolf Hitler, a technological marvel that promised to turn the tide of war in the air. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was fast, heavily armed, and unlike anything the Allies had seen before. But as with so many of Hitler's late-war ambitions, brilliance alone would not suffice. The Me 262 came too late, constrained by logistics, politics, and the chaotic state of a collapsing Reich. Yet, even in its limited deployment, it left an indelible mark on the future of aerial combat. The conception of the Me 262 began years before it ever flew. German engineers, driven by a vision of speed and innovation, sought to leapfrog conventional aircraft technology. While most of the world's fighters relied on piston engines, the idea of a turbojet engine promised unparalleled performance. Engineers such as Hans von Ohain and the Messerschmitt design team worked tirelessly to develop engines capable of sustained high-speed flight, while simultaneously refining aerodynamics to handle the stresses of jet propulsion. By the early 1940s, the prototype Me 262 had taken shape. Sleek lines, a swept-wing design, and a fuselage that spoke of speed and lethality. It was a machine designed not just to compete but to dominate, but the Me 262's journey from concept to combat was anything but smooth. Technical challenges abounded. Jet engines of the era were temperamental and prone to failure. Even minor imperfections could lead to catastrophic outcomes in flight. Early prototypes suffered frequent engine fires, and the metallurgy required for turbine blades pushed German industry to the limits of its capabilities. Each flight was a calculated risk, and the engineers, mechanics, and test pilots who labored on the project understood that every day brought them closer to both innovation and disaster. Hitler's interference, meanwhile, complicated matters further. Initially, he insisted the Me 262 be developed as a fast bomber rather than as a pure fighter, a decision that delayed its introduction to the front lines and frustrated Messerschmitt and his team. Despite these obstacles, the first Me 262s eventually rolled out of production lines by mid-1944, arriving in limited numbers at Luftwaffe bases in France and Germany. Pilots who first flew the jets were awestruck by their speed. Where a conventional piston-engine fighter might reach 400 miles per hour, the Me 262 could exceed 540 miles per hour. It climbed quickly, maneuvered with agility at high speeds, and carried 430 cannons capable of destroying even the heaviest Allied bombers in a single pass. In theory, it was the perfect counter to the Allied air assault, fast enough to outpace enemy fighters, deadly enough to obliterate bombers, and advanced enough to alter the dynamics of the air war. In practice, however, reality was far more complex. The jet's performance advantages were mitigated by numerous operational limitations. Engines wore out rapidly, often after as few as 25 to 30 hours of flight, requiring constant maintenance and replacement parts that were increasingly scarce. Fuel shortages plagued the Luftwaffe, forcing pilots to ration the very substance that powered their most advanced aircraft. And while the Me 262 could outfly virtually any Allied plane in a straight line, it struggled in dogfights at lower speeds, where nimble propeller-driven fighters such as the P-51 Mustang could maneuver more effectively. Pilots had to adopt hit-and-run tactics, striking from high altitude and retreating before interception, a strategy that required discipline, training, and careful timing, all in short supply in the chaos of 1944. The human element was just as critical as the technology. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots had been decimated over the course of years of continuous combat. By the time the Me 262 entered service, Germany faced a shortage of veteran airmen capable of fully exploiting its capabilities. Many pilots were young, hastily trained, and thrown into combat with little preparation. For them, the Me 262 was both a weapon and a hazard. Its speed amplified mistakes, and mechanical failures could be fatal. The learning curve was brutal, and the Allies soon noticed the emergence of a new, faster threat in the skies, though they could not immediately grasp its full potential. Allied intelligence had been aware of German jet research for some time, but it underestimated the pace of development and the impact the Me 262 could have if deployed effectively. When reports finally confirmed operational jet fighters, the Allies faced a strategic challenge: how to counter a plane that could outrun every conventional fighter. Fighter escort tactics had to adapt, bomber formations were modified, and high-speed intercepts became a necessary, dangerous gamble. Yet even with these adaptations, Me-262 pilots achieved remarkable results in the brief windows of opportunity they had. Accounts describe Allied bomber formations shredded in minutes by concentrated Me-262 attacks, as pilots used altitude, speed, and surprise to devastating effect. But the Me-262's promise was never fully realized. Its deployment coincided with the final months of a collapsing German military. Allied bombing campaigns had decimated production facilities, transportation networks were disrupted, and fuel became increasingly scarce. Political interference continued to hinder operations. Hitler's insistence on using the Me-262 as a bomber delayed fighter deployment and reduced its immediate impact on the air war. Even when committed to air superiority missions, the jets could rarely be massed in sufficient numbers to challenge the overwhelming Allied presence in the sky. The plane that might have turned the tide arrived too late, and in numbers too small to change the course of the conflict. Despite these constraints, the Me-262's psychological effect on both sides was profound. For the Allies, the mere sight of a jet streaking across the sky at impossible speed was a harbinger of technological innovation and potential devastation. For the Germans, it represented both hope and frustration, a tangible symbol of ingenuity hampered by circumstance. Propaganda lauded it as the miracle weapon, a tool that could rescue the Reich from the brink of defeat. Pilots risked everything to fly it, knowing that each sortie might be their last, and each mission carried the weight of Hitler's expectations, both realistic and delusional. Combat reports illustrate the extraordinary and sometimes tragic nature of Me-262 operations. Pilots describe intercepting Allied formations, unleashing a salvo of cannon fire, and watching bombers disintegrate in midair. They recount encounters with Mustang and Thunderbolt fighters, where speed and surprise were essential for survival. Losses were high not necessarily due to the aircraft's inadequacy, but because of external factors. Ground attacks during takeoff and landing, mechanical failures, and the scarcity of experienced crew. The Me-262 could dominate in the air, but it was never immune to the strategic realities of a war that Germany was already losing. The jet's armament made it particularly lethal against heavy bombers. 430 Mk108 cannons could obliterate a B-17 or Lancaster with a single well-aimed burst. Me-262 pilots perfected slashing attacks, dive from high altitude, fire a precise salvo, and climb away before escort fighters could respond. These tactics exploited the aircraft's strengths while minimizing exposure. The effectiveness of such missions was undeniable, but it also highlighted the limitations of strategic timing and industrial capacity. Even with the potential to decimate bomber formations, the Me-262 could not be deployed in sufficient numbers to reverse the Allies' strategic advantage. Every victory was isolated and every sortie risked failure or death. The Me-262 also influenced post-war thinking about air combat. Its introduction forced a reevaluation of aircraft design, highlighting the advantages of jet propulsion, speed, and integrated weapons systems. Engineers and strategists noted that the future of air warfare would be defined not by piston engines and propellers, but by the mastery of high-speed flight, radar integration, and precision weaponry. Even in defeat, the Me-262 left a blueprint for modern fighter design, inspiring post-war jets from both the United States and the Soviet Union. Yet the story of the Me-262 is not merely one of technological achievement. It is a cautionary tale about the consequences of politics, strategy, and timing in warfare. The aircraft was born from ingenuity but hampered by interference. It had the potential to alter the course of the air war, yet its impact was constrained by logistical chaos, fuel shortages, and a strategic environment already stacked against Germany. It exemplifies how even the most advanced weapon cannot succeed without the infrastructure, training, and strategy to support it. The pilots who flew the Me-262 became legends in their own right. Some survived the war, recounting tales of speed, fear, and death-defying maneuvers. Others perished in the final battles, their bodies and aircraft lost to history. Their experiences illuminate the human dimension of innovation, the courage required to fly an aircraft that outclassed every foe, and the vulnerability inherent in being part of a system stretched beyond its limits. For them, the Me-262 was both a triumph and a tragedy, a machine that could have dominated the skies but could not overcome the collapse of the Reich. By the winter of 1944-1945, the Me-262's operational history was largely written. Only a few hundred had flown combat missions. Its contributions, while impressive, could not stem the Allied advance. Factories were overrun, airfields destroyed, and pilots captured or killed. Yet in the brief flashes of combat, the Me-262 demonstrated the future of aerial warfare. Speed, precision, and technological innovation. It proved that air superiority was no longer solely about numbers or experience. It was increasingly about the machines themselves and the ability to leverage cutting-edge technology effectively. The Me-262 also exposed the limits of miracle weapons in wartime strategy. Hitler's insistence on technological solutions over practical deployment, combined with the deteriorating industrial and logistical base, ensured that even extraordinary innovations could not compensate for systemic weaknesses. The jet fighter symbolized both the genius and folly of the Third Reich's final years: brilliance constrained by chaos, promise undermined by timing, and power limited by circumstance. The legacy of the Me-262 extends beyond its brief operational history. It influenced post-war air doctrine, accelerated the development of jet technology globally, and reshaped the understanding of air combat in the jet age. It is remembered not merely as a weapon of war, but as a pivotal point in the history of aviation, demonstrating the possibilities and limitations of technological innovation under pressure. Its story underscores a timeless lesson. The most advanced machine cannot succeed without the strategy, training, and support necessary to wield it effectively. Even today, historians study the Me-262 as an example of how timing, logistics, and strategy can determine the impact of revolutionary technology. It remains a subject of fascination for engineers, military strategists, and enthusiasts of World War II aviation. The jet's sleek lines, terrifying speed, and deadly armament continue to capture the imagination, symbolizing both the pinnacle of wartime ingenuity and the tragic consequences of arriving too late. In the skies over a collapsing Germany, the Me-262 was the last gamble of a desperate dictator, a glimpse of the future that arrived too late to change the past. By the summer of 1944, the Me-262 began to trickle into operational Luftwaffe units. Pilots were assigned to specialized jet wings known as commando units, elite formations tasked with testing the jet in combat and evaluating tactics against the Allied air onslaught. These units operated from hastily constructed airfields, often concealed in forests or near the edges of bombed-out towns, designed to minimize vulnerability to Allied reconnaissance and bombing raids. For many pilots, the arrival of the Me-262 was a mix of exhilaration and apprehension. They understood that this aircraft could outrun any conventional fighter, yet they also faced a machine prone to failure, sensitive to the slightest miscalculation, and demanding the utmost skill to operate safely. The first missions of the Me-262 were a revelation to both German and Allied forces. Flying at speeds that exceeded 500 miles per hour, the jets could intercept Allied bomber formations long before conventional fighters could arrive. The 430 Mk-108 cannons proved devastating against heavily armored B-17s and Lancasters. Allied crews recounted terrifying encounters where a single Me-262 dive could tear apart a bomber in seconds, leaving only twisted metal and fire trailing through the sky. In this narrow window of opportunity, the jets could strike decisively and retreat before P-51 Mustangs or P-47 Thunderbolts could react. Yet these successes were fragile. The Me-262's engines required careful management. Pilots had to throttle cautiously during takeoff and landing to prevent flameouts or turbine damage. Any mechanical failure often meant death, as the jet had little margin for error near the ground. Many early missions ended in crashes caused not by enemy fire but by engine malfunction or pilot error. Fuel shortages compounded the risk, forcing pilots to conserve precious jet fuel during both training and combat. In a war already strained by logistics, each sortie became a calculated gamble. Ground crews, too, faced an uphill battle. Jet engines of the era were maintenance nightmares. Bearings and turbines wore quickly, metallurgy could not always withstand high temperatures, and replacement parts were scarce due to Allied bombing of factories and transport lines. Even a successful sortie required days of careful maintenance afterward. The Me-262 demanded a level of attention, expertise, and resources that Germany could barely sustain in the final year of the war. The Luftwaffe found itself caught between the promise of technological superiority and the harsh realities of operational limitation. The pilot's accounts reveal a complex picture of the jet's combat effectiveness. Veteran Luftwaffe ace Kurt Welter, flying some of the earliest Me-262 missions over Northern Europe, described the exhilaration of closing on bomber formations at speeds conventional fighters could not match. You could see them aim and fire and then disappear before anyone knew what hit them, he recalled. Yet even he acknowledged the limitations. One engine out or a misjudged approach and there was no room to recover. The plane was a marvel, but it was unforgiving. Such sentiments were echoed across multiple units. The Me-262 could dominate under the right circumstances, but success required coordination, discipline, and a level of skill increasingly rare among Germany's dwindling pool of experienced pilots. Allied forces quickly adapted. Intelligence reports identified the Me-262 as a high-speed threat, prompting the development of new tactics. Interceptors began patrolling near-known jet bases, targeting aircraft during takeoff and landing, the Me-262's most vulnerable moments. Allied pilots learned that although they could not outfly the jets in open sky, they could strike when the Germans were slow, encumbered, or mechanically weak. Bomber formations were modified to increase defensive firepower, and escort fighters were instructed to watch for high-speed dives. These countermeasures gradually reduced the Me-262's effectiveness in large-scale engagements, though isolated encounters still favored the jet. One of the Me-262's most remarkable qualities was psychological. Allied airmen spoke of its near-mythical speed, describing the terror of seeing a streak of metal approach faster than anything they had flown before. Bomber crews, often exhausted from long missions over Germany, faced the prospect of annihilation from an aircraft that could appear and vanish before warning systems could react. Propaganda and rumor only amplified its fearsome reputation. For German pilots, the Me-262 represented hope, a chance to reclaim air superiority, but it also carried enormous pressure. Every sortie felt weighted by expectation, each engagement a potential demonstration of national pride and technological prowess. Despite the excitement surrounding its operational debut, the Me-262's numbers were painfully limited. Only a few hundred jets were ever deployed, a fraction of what would have been required to influence the overall air campaign. Allied numerical superiority remained overwhelming. Thousands of bombers and fighters operated daily over Germany, outmatching the jets by sheer volume. The Me-262's successes, though dramatic, were isolated. Even in its best missions, the jets could not fully offset the strategic air campaign that relentlessly targeted German cities, factories, and transport lines. Every tactical victory highlighted the disparity between technological promise and operational reality. Fuel shortages were particularly devastating. By late 1944, Germany faced severe limitations in both conventional aviation fuel and high-grade jet fuel. The Me-262's turbojets consumed enormous quantities of fuel for each sortie, leaving pilots with tight margins for attack and return. In many cases, missions were canceled or aborted due to insufficient fuel, grounding what might have been the most effective jet fighter in history. Pilots and commanders faced the frustrating reality that an advanced aircraft meant little without the logistical infrastructure to sustain it. The Me-262 also exposed the limits of strategic planning in the Third Reich. Hitler's insistence on using the jet as a bomber delayed its adoption as a fighter, while competing priorities within the Luftwaffe and Armaments Ministry created bureaucratic friction. Factories were bombed, transport networks disrupted, and raw materials scarce. Even when jets were built, delivery to frontline units was inconsistent. Operational units frequently had only a handful of aircraft ready at any given time. While conceptually revolutionary, the Me-262's deployment reflected the chaotic state of German war planning, where brilliance collided with dysfunction. Nonetheless, in the hands of skilled pilots, the Me-262 proved terrifyingly effective. Accounts describe precision strikes on Allied formations, where a single jet could rip through multiple bombers before retreating beyond the reach of escorts. Pilots like Heinz Baer and Erich Rudorfer demonstrated the potential of speed, surprise, and concentrated firepower. They perfected hit-and-run tactics, exploiting altitude advantages and timing attacks to maximize lethality. Each sortie became a demonstration of the jet's capabilities, revealing what modern air combat could achieve when technology was leveraged expertly. The Me-262 also influenced tactical thought beyond Germany. Allied engineers and strategists began to understand that future air combat would be defined not only by pilot skill, but by aircraft performance. Speed, climb rate, and firepower became increasingly critical in design philosophy. Radar integration, high-speed aerodynamics, and jet propulsion became central to post-war air doctrine. Even in limited deployment, the Me-262 had changed the conversation about what was possible in the skies, a glimpse of the jet age long before it dominated every theater of combat. Yet the human cost remained staggering. Pilots often flew multiple missions under extreme stress, knowing that mechanical failure, enemy fire, or misjudgment could be fatal. The high-speed nature of the jet left little room for error. Crashes during takeoff or landing were common, and combat losses, though fewer than those experienced by conventional aircraft, were concentrated among the most experienced pilots, whose loss was difficult to replace. The Me-262 highlighted a cruel paradox. An aircraft of unprecedented capability could not fully realize its potential without trained operators, maintenance crews, and fuel, a system that Germany could no longer sustain. In addition to air-to-air combat, the Me-262 faced constant threats from Allied ground attacks. Reconnaissance flights identified jet bases, and strafing or bombing missions frequently destroyed aircraft on the ground before they could even take off. The vulnerability during launch and landing runs highlighted the limitations of innovation when faced with overwhelming numbers and air dominance. Even the most advanced fighter was helpless without protection and logistical support. The Me-262 also reshaped German tactical thinking. Pilots experimented with bomber interception strategies, coordinated attacks, and integrated ground support. Commanders sought ways to maximize the aircraft's impact in localized engagements, yet these tactics could never be applied on a strategic scale. The Reich lacked sufficient jets, trained personnel, and fuel to dominate the sky comprehensively. Each mission, no matter how brilliant, remained a tactical success within a framework of strategic failure. By late 1944 and early 1945, the Me-262's operational history was defined by a combination of extraordinary technological achievement and profound systemic limitations. Pilots could win individual engagements, destroy Allied bombers with devastating efficiency, and demonstrate the potential of the jet age. But the broader air campaign continued to favor the Allies, whose industrial might, numerical advantage, and logistical resilience ensured that the Luftwaffe could not recover. The Me-262's story became a case study in the importance of integrating technological innovation with strategy, logistics, and human factors. In many ways, the Me-262's short operational period serves as a microcosm of Germany's late-war predicament: brilliance constrained by scarcity, innovation limited by infrastructure, and hope undermined by strategic collapse. The jet represented the pinnacle of German aeronautical engineering, yet its potential was unrealized. Every sortie showcased what could have been possible, while simultaneously reminding the world of what arrived too late to change the course of war. The Me-262's legacy extended far beyond its operational impact. Post-war, both the United States and the Soviet Union studied captured jets, reverse-engineered engines, and integrated design concepts into their own aircraft development programs. The lessons learned in speed, aerodynamics, and armament directly influenced early Cold War jet fighters, from the F-86 Sabre to the MiG-15. While it could not save Germany, the Me-262 shaped the future of aerial combat, proving that the jet age had arrived and that the next generation of war would be defined by velocity, precision, and technological innovation. By the early months of 1945, Germany was a nation in collapse, and the Me-262, once heralded as Hitler's miracle weapon, became a symbol of both brilliance and futility. Pilots continued to fly, risking life and machine against the ever-growing tide of Allied bombers and fighters, but the strategic situation had shifted irrevocably. The skies that the Me-262 could dominate in theory were crowded with overwhelming numbers, relentless coordination, and a logistical system that no longer functioned. Yet even in this chaos, the jet left an undeniable mark, its speed and firepower repeatedly shocking Allied crews, leaving burned-out wrecks of B-17s and Lancasters in its wake, and demonstrating that the future of air warfare would be defined by velocity and precision. For those who flew it, the Me-262 was both a miracle and a curse. Veterans recalled the adrenaline of high-speed dives, the blur of clouds rushing past, and the crushing recoil of the third-beam cannons as enemy bombers disintegrated beneath them. They also remembered the ever-present danger of mechanical failure, of engines flaming out mid-flight or landing gear collapsing upon touchdown. Fuel was scarce, engines fragile, and experience scarce. Every sortie required courage, calculation, and luck. The jet demanded absolute respect, and the men who flew it bore the weight of a desperate nation's expectations, even as defeat loomed inevitably. Despite its limited numbers, the Me-262 influenced air combat in ways that transcended its operational record. Tactics evolved rapidly around its unique capabilities. Hit-and-run attacks, high-speed interceptions, and coordinated strikes against bomber formations became essential skills for its pilots. Allied forces responded by adapting bomber formations, developing interception strategies, and learning to exploit the jet's vulnerabilities during takeoff and landing. The duel between innovation and adaptation defined the closing months of the air war over Europe, a deadly chess match conducted at hundreds of miles per hour. Yet the Me-262's greatest lesson lay not in individual victories or tactical encounters, but in the stark contrast between technological potential and strategic reality. No matter how advanced, no matter how fast or lethal, the jet could not compensate for shortages of fuel, trained pilots, or a collapsing infrastructure. Its story illustrates a timeless truth of warfare. A weapon is only as effective as the system that supports it. Even genius cannot overcome chaos, and even miracles cannot reverse a tide of strategic defeat. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces penetrated deeper into Germany, the Me-262's operational significance dwindled. Airfields were captured or destroyed, fuel reserves evaporated, and pilots were killed, captured, or reassigned. The jet's brief moment in the skies was over, leaving behind scattered wrecks and tales of awe-inspiring feats. For a machine that could have changed air warfare, its arrival was tragically late, and its impact constrained by circumstance rather than capability. The legacy of the Me-262, however, endured far beyond its short combat career. Post-war, its captured examples were studied meticulously by the United States, the Soviet Union, and other nations eager to understand the secrets of jet propulsion and high-speed aerodynamics. Its design influenced the first generation of Cold War fighters, from the MiG-15 to the F-86 Sabre, laying the foundation for modern aerial combat. The Me-262 proved that the age of jets had arrived, and that speed, armament, and technological sophistication would define the future of air power. Historians reflect on the Me-262 not just as a plane, but as a lesson in the interplay between innovation and timing. Its pilots were courageous, its design revolutionary, yet it was a weapon of genius that arrived too late to alter the course of the war it was meant to save. It exemplifies how even the most advanced technology is subject to human, logistical, and political limitations, and how the outcome of history hinges not on machines alone, but on the context in which they are deployed. The Me-262's story, therefore, is both awe-inspiring and cautionary. It symbolizes the extraordinary heights of human ingenuity under pressure, the desperation of a nation clinging to hope through technology, and the unforgiving realities of war. It remains one of the most iconic aircraft of World War II, a machine that shaped the trajectory of aviation and left an indelible mark on military history. Its name endures in museums, books, and the memories of those who witnessed or flew it, a reminder that innovation, while powerful, must meet the right moment to achieve its full potential. In the end, Hitler's last gamble in the sky, the Me-262 arrived as a marvel, flew as a terror, and fell as a witness to the collapse of a regime. It demonstrated the promise of technology, the bravery of those who wielded it, and the inexorable truth that in war, timing, strategy, and resources are as decisive as ingenuity. The Me-262 came too late to save the Third Reich, yet it arrived in time to change the skies forever, heralding the dawn of the jet age and leaving a legacy that would influence aerial warfare for decades to come.